Oh, sorry. I'm honored to be invited to give this key speech for the 25th anniversary of the Prince Claus Fund. The collaboration with the Prince Claus Fund and partnership with the Cultural Emergency Response and Network has been ongoing since 2008, which coincides with the establishment of the Doan Architecture Foundation that I set up with colleagues in Yemen. I will discuss the role of earth architecture, its relationship with city making and culture that transcends the concept of time, or concepts of time, or the divide in time, connecting the flow instead. The works we have successfully completed in Hadramaut over this period is practice-oriented, inspired by and complicit with a strong living culture that is endangered. In this context, I will expand on the embodied research and practice in in-depth crises, a world of earth architecture that identifies with and shares the premise of politics that created the need and basis of the Prince Claus Fund. I'll be discussing separate sections, if you like, and the first and foremost involves the failure of ecosystems in our environments. In 1972, when I joined the Architectural Association as a student, first-year student, I recall that we were all asked to buy a book that had just come out called A Blueprint for Survival, which I still have a copy of here. It makes me wonder that throughout this time, and this was a series of articles published and supported by scientists, including Julian Huxley, that were published by The Ecologist. I'm wondering after all this time how, with the upcoming COP26, the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow in November 2021, we are still confronted with the failure of our ecosystems. In fact, we are confronted with the failure of our ecosystems as if it's a new discovery. The summit, we are reminded, is seen as crucial if climate change is to be brought under control. This comes as no surprise following the absence in response over the last several decades of depleting the natural resources and geological landscape resulting in our endangered planet. This has been precipitated and accompanied by destruction through occupation, wars, indiscriminate killing, displacement, and acts of urbicidi or urbicide, eroding cities, communities, and settlements' livelihoods and habitats, notwithstanding the destruction of culture and heritage in the process. If it were not, of course, it isn't collateral damage, and it is targeted, as we all know. Engaging within this forbidding labyrinth on a physical and psychological level is a reality, drawing a despairing landscape with disease, increasing poverty and famine, the vacuum of education, terror, lack of education, terror, and human suffering that has mired communities living with the breakdown of infrastructure, water systems, power, and ecosystems in entire countries. Not in any abstract country. The deep layers of collapse, both tangible and intangible, are witnessed across the spectrum. Painful reminders are Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Egypt, Gaza and the West Bank, Afghanistan, and finally, Yemen. This is where I'm coming from. In parallel, the conversation hypotheses and polemic for creating sustainable communities upon this pervading complexity, even if approached philosophically, cannot take place without considering the ecological balance of the environment, both the natural, earth, water, flora and fauna, and the built environment. This is not a blueprint for utopia, but the preconditions for creating sustainable or dignified living criteria and allow the natural processes of organic evolution. Utopia, after all, is an impossibility that becomes possible once the obstacle is removed. And Robert Musil elaborated on this in his book, The Man Without Qualities. It is, after all, the 6 impossible things that Alice sometimes believes in before breakfast. Every catastrophe or severe act of destruction is a catalyst that triggers inspirational action and application. And in this case, it is through emergency reconstruction and response for long-time strategies. The politics of Earth and the planet. In 2019, the building sector's carbon emission hit an all-time high. 38% of all the world's energy-related CO2 consumption is currently caused by the building construction industry. The mainstay industrial construction materials, concrete, glass, steel, are energy intensive to produce, have critically depleted natural resources, and are energy inefficient when built. In short, modern building methods have an unnecessarily high carbon footprint that must be reduced. The UN had set a goal of halving direct building CO2 emissions by 2030 in order to be able to achieve net zero carbon building by 2050. Energy efficient buildings and construction methods are crucial for producing a low carbon emission future. That much we have known for several years. In a recent article on the 2021 RIBA Royal Institute of Rich Architects Sterling Prize, Oliver Wainwright discusses the shortlisted buildings. He writes, "It was an impressive range, but something was missing. At a time when the built environment is responsible for about 40% of global carbon emissions, the importance of retrofitting existing structures is ever more crucial to averting the climate catastrophe." The shortlisted projects included the new Cambridge Central Mosque, with fluted wooden columns extending to an interlace of a geometric lattice canopy, stretching above the space, masking the sky. The 23 million first eco-friendly mosque boasts zero carbon on-site emissions, rainwater harvesting, and air source heat pumps. This was reported by the BBC on the 24th of April 2019, prior to the opening of the mosque, while Oliver Wainwright's article was only last week on the 14th of October. What we need to think about is how a 23 million building can be eco-friendly in this situation. That's a question to be asked. The winning project nominated was the Kingston University London complex. As the gong goes to a handsome concerto of concrete, which Wainwright writes, for which no embodied carbon assessment was conducted, we might ask when we will see a refurbishment rightfully recognized. Refurbishment, retrofitting, renovation, or adaptive reuse are terms operating on the establishment of an alternative premise to mitigate and cut down the high carbon footprint of the building industry's continued erosive role in the environment. In other words, an appeal to reconsider existing structures and buildings that can be rehabilitated, rebuilt, and constructed or retrofitted, and given a new lease on life. This addresses cities where older building stock is readily demolished to make way for new construction sites, and the warped negative trajectory that has been relentlessly at work over the past decades propagating city building development. Leon Crier's famous statement in 1987, "I'm an architect because I don't build," was a revelation as far as I was concerned at the time. Not because it was anti-modernist, but because he challenged an overwhelming trend of design and construction that was increasingly devoid of order, principles, and sense of connectedness with the natural landscape and communities it was serving. These are my words. The same architecture that has successively, whether inadvertently or irresponsibly, contributed to the damage of the ecological balance and the failure of ecosystems. This is not to undermine or dismiss the creative projects of architecture within the modern sphere and selected projects and works of Tadao Ando, Peter Zumthor, Renzo Piano, Keng, and Wang Shu, just to name a few. However, we're interested here in the lesser-known architects who are constantly pushing the boundaries and norms of cliché architecture. In the emerging patterns and paradigms, I'm often reminded of a saying Hassan Fathy once told me. He told me we need a revolution, a mud brick revolution. This was in 1984. The Egyptian architect Hassan Fathy, 1901 to 1989, author of Architecture for the Poor, which was published in 1973, and Natural Energy and Vernacular Architecture, 1988, was visionary in establishing a new model for thinking and advocating Earth architecture's economic and ecological value. In 1963, Fathy sent a long letter to the Egyptian president Jamal Abdel Nasser, highlighting the dire situation and condition of rural housing in Egypt, identifying the problem with social and political policies, projects, planners, and ignorant architects. It was a plea to re-educate society and consider the vernacular architectural wealth extant in the Nubian villages of the Nile as an example par excellence for developing the rural villages and landscape. The letter was published in my book, Hassan Fathy, Earth and Utopia, in 2018. I quote a short extract here in relation to education. He writes, "It is imperative that we review all the specialist educational syllabi in architecture and engineering at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Existing syllabi make no mention whatsoever of indigenous rural architecture, which explains why all efforts to promote such methods hit a brick wall in many government departments," unquote. In the 1970s, Fathy was accused of being a nostalgic, seeking to reinvent the past, an aristocrat who afforded the luxury of designing for the poor and building mansions for the rich. The truth was that the villages and housing he was designing and building were successively failed by the bureaucracy and contractors who were threatened by his revival of an earth architecture culture that aborts the possibility of profit and speculation. This was the beginning of the housing corporation industry, as capitalist economy was taking hold of shaping the urban development economy with the promise of new concrete social housing for a dystopian, brave new world. Decades later, his work has precedence in addressing the resultant chaos in cities, social housing, and the deteriorating rural landscape. That which he foresaw, warned against, and suffered fighting in isolation. Fathy initially found his inspiration in the urban fabric of the Islamic city of Cairo, with its complex composition of architecture and crafts, then moved to the villages of Upper Egypt, where he discovered the architecture of mud brick construction that inspired him immensely to learn from and proceed to work with the master builders who he found were the guardians of a building knowledge and culture. His unfinished and realized projects and resultant oeuvre is the material to contemplate and get our students and architects to understand, to be able to assess the same matrix and dialogue he tirelessly endeavored to propose. A dialogue between the center and periphery, the urban and rural, between the modern and contemporary, to negotiate the chasm between past Islamic Medina quarters and vernacular architecture and future city development. This required instilling culture with a capital C back into our space, our spaces, our design, to understand the role of design, architecture, education, in city making. Today, amongst mounting environmental pressure, the international scientific and architecture community are showing an increasing interest in earth architecture's potential as a valuable resource for future design and construction, capable of contributing to sustainable and economically viable solutions. Exceptional architecture projects based on earth, pushing the boundaries of vernacular concepts and technologies, is best exemplified in the work of Jordanian architect Ammar Khammash. Informed by a fascination with geology and nature, he questions in one instance how an architect dares disturb or interfere with the natural landscape without listening to it and embracing it. He advocated working with art, music, and nature to create architecture, a refreshing response or point of departure to the landscape of destruction and debris caused by architects, and in taking architecture back to nature. He reminds us that the Jordanian desert he is inspired by is falling apart. Bulldozers are there with illegal quarrying, creating holes in the landscape. He writes, architecture is a crime since we are cutting away, exporting rock and stone to the Gulf countries, often with fossils in them. Drawing attention for the need to learn how biology designs, examining fossilized trees, where botanical paleontology and vertebrate paleontology play a part in the bone and skeletal design. For Khammash, botany is a course that should be taught in architecture. It is the only way, he says, architecture can survive if it behaves like nature. Earth architecture technologies are important from two perspectives. Environmentally, as a sustainable, energy-efficient building material and as a valuable cultural heritage asset. From either perspective, their significance can be seen at both global and regional scales. At a global scale, Earth architectural technologies are significant because of the wide availability of their natural resources, the simplicity of their production, limited transportation, and manual application or assembly that are both energy efficient and cost effective. The ecological value of Earth architecture cannot be overstated. The thermal properties that allow buildings to utilize their natural passive energy or free energy, keeping interiors naturally cool when hot outside and warm when cold. Mud brick walls benefit from high thermal mass, low thermal conductivity, and become a thermal buffer and high thermal capacity. The evolving technological developments in Earth architecture, coupled with the ingenuity and creativity of their builders, manifested some of the world's most unique and acclaimed cultural heritage sites, considered to be a common heritage of humankind. In 2011, more than 10% of UNESCO's World Heritage properties incorporated Earth architecture technologies. The wide availability of its materials and their economic and ecological qualifications give Earth architecture technological enormous potential to contribute to poverty, elevation, and sustainable development. But Earth architecture, its heritage, and the accumulated knowledge of its technologies are increasingly threatened by natural and human impacts: floods, earthquakes, industrialization, urbanization, modern building technologies, disappearance of traditional conservation practices, etc. About a quarter of sites included on the World Heritage List in danger are Earth architecture sites. The problem is perhaps best represented in Yemen, where one of the richest and most sophisticated expressions of Earth architecture is currently being endangered by the ongoing war. The effects of climate change, ill-conceived, unsustainable industrialization, migration. Yemen alone contains 3 Earth architecture sites on UNESCO's heritage list: Shibam, Sana'a, and Zabid, all of which are also included on its list in danger. In the case of both Sana'a and Shibam, we are contending with a powerful living culture, in an authority and wonder in the art of architecture, a legacy that is exceptional in vocabulary and creative composition of city making that has not been superseded. This has been a leading anchor in understanding the importance of architecture that does not subscribe to the travesty of temporality, where the fictional divide between the past and the future does not exist. The past, or the series of events that form the past, become the cultural and social narrative that inspires the continuity of passage, the continuity and time flow of this knowledge. I was extremely vindicated when I found the book of Carlo Rovelli, beautifully written and revealing, under the title of The Order of Time. Takes us through the meaning and analysis of time in the grammar of the world, its geometry and intangible construction. He writes, "Why to us is the past so different from the future?" And reminds us, 19th and 20th century physics engaged with these questions and ran into something unexpected and disconcerting: the difference between past and future, between cause and effect, between memory and hope, between regret and intention. In the elementary laws that describe the mechanisms of the world, there is no such difference. So, the premise where I always maintained that the work of architecture we do is not related to history, is not related to the past. As far as we are concerned, this is contemporary, a contemporary need, a prerequisite for a future that's in the making, was vindicated by Carlo Rovelli, explaining the theory of time and not reminding us, informing us is the better word. And he comes and then explains that the distinction that we often make between past and future is actually this blurred vision. It is a blurred vision in the physics and chemistry of the scientists who were behind this discovery. Whilst environmental and geographical challenges have contributed to slower industrial development in Yemen, this pace of development is also in part responsible for the richness and distinctive character of their earth architecture culture. The consistent and uninterpreted use of earth materials, tools, and techniques that have been handed down by their practitioners over centuries has produced a wealth of accumulated knowledge that is the essential component in the making process. I'm going to approach the subject of lost cities from the cultural heritage perspective. In a paper I wrote on the Medina and the Arab city, which was a chapter published in the book, The Rebel City, or La Vie Rebelle, that was edited by Yana Ravdin, I wrote of the Medina as the Islamic or Arab city and the nomad urban renewal. I investigated the concept and culture of the Medina and made association with Islamic philosophy and the writings of the philosopher al-Farabi, 10th century, and the sociologist and historian Ibn Khaldun on the idea and formation of the city. The latter is of the 14th century. Al-Farabi, who died in 950, was an outstanding logician and metaphysician, attributed with the first systematic exposition of Neoplatonism in Arabic. He grew up in Damascus and read philosophy books at night while working as a gardener by day before he was drawn to Baghdad, the center of logical instruction, where he studied. Among his major works is the opinion of the inhabitants of the virtuous city, thus translated through the works of Majid Fakhri and Mohsin Mahdi, both that had excellent translations of the work of both Farabi and Ibn Khaldun that I relied on. The virtuous city, we are told, is essentially one in which the good or happy life is pursued and in which the virtues proliferate. Virtue, in this case, alluding to true knowledge of divine and natural beings, leads to acting in accordance with this to attain human perfection or happiness. The attainment of happiness means the perfection of that power of the human soul and is specific to man, his reason. This in turn requires disciplining the lower desires to cooperate with and aid reason to perform its proper activity, and also acquiring the highest arts and sciences. End of quote. Once the main features of the virtuous city are discussed, al-Farabi proceeds to identify 4 other cities, defining these as the city of ignorance, the wayward, the renegade, and the erring. This further explanation might appear to be outside the remit of our discussion on the city plan, order, and social organization. However, considering the layers and complex composition of the Medina we are left to contemplate, the hypothesis is certainly pertinent, and I shall return to the relevance of the Medina in our present context. Culture became the lost component, culture as the true knowledge, accounting for what is missing in our lost cities. The facets of knowledge, true knowledge, that al-Farabi referred to above in his analysis of the virtual city, encompassed divine and natural human knowledge. Emphasis was placed on the science of geometry, which is given prominence in the discussion of the rational faculty and the active intellect, as the first of the principles, identified in the first category of principles universally accepted as true, the primary principles of geometric knowledge. The last sentence is quoted and was essentially originally advocated by Plato. The primary principles of geometrical knowledge and the first category of principles universally accepted as true. In the Muqaddimah, on the other hand, a critical study of the history of philosophy, sociology, and culture, Ibn Khaldun, 14th to 15th century, elaborates on the city building and architecture, which he writes is the first and oldest craft of sedentary civilization. Architects, he says, differ in exercising the craft. Some are intelligent and skillful, others are inferior, and adds the use of engineering principles and geometric proportions in construction. Incidentally, Ibn Khaldun does not mention the architect by name. He speaks of engineering principles, he speaks of engineers and construction, and he discusses craftsmanship. In his study on the philosophy of Ibn Khaldun, Muhsin Mahdi points out that he also says the general significance of the term culture is the same as the polis or Medina. The mention of crafts is inseparable in Ibn Khaldun's account of cities and culture. One of the headings in the same chapter on building reads, "The crafts recede from cities that are close to ruin," explaining that the decrease of a city's civilization results in the craft institutions disappearing altogether. The Yemen, along with Bahrain, Oman, and Al Jazeera, meaning the peninsula, writes Ibn Khaldun, has belonged to different nations. They also founded cities and towns there and promoted the development of sedentary culture and luxury of the highest degree. The imprint of sedentary culture, he continues, established itself firmly. The crafts became abundant and firmly rooted. They have remained and have always renewed themselves down to this time in the late 14th century. End of quote. In fact, the existence of crafts in a city was an indication as to whether the city is still alive. This reminds me of Hassan Fathy, who used to say, "The city is made of 1,000,000 axes." And when asked what these axes were, he said the crafts. This is not exclusive to the building crafts, Ibn Khaldun adds, citing carpentry, ceramic tiles, calligraphy, carving, painting, but he includes crafts that secure the livelihood of the inhabitants and consolidates their specialty and sophistication: weaving, dyed threads and fabric, embroidery, traditional dress and accessories, natural perfumes, food products and preserves, silver, copper, and glassware, ceramics, glass, pottery, and carpentry. And these are cited by Ibn Khaldun. It is those crafts that keep the soul of the Medina and its tangible spaces alive, both as a center for production, for exhibiting these crafts, and providing the vital outlet for rural areas and domestic production to continue producing and engaging with the city economically and socially. The above sketches the backdrop for working with receding towns and cities devoid of culture. The daunting task of negotiating spaces within neglected and forgotten cities has been an occupation that has defined the relevance and future of our work, or present of our work. Here, unfinished or unrealized projects matter, becoming a fulfilling landscape against a temporal condition, a prospect that is not hindered by or subject to success or failure, or the definition of either. Operating at the margin means engaging with communities and builders, with walls of earth, materials, and crafts of ingenious construction systems. Negotiating the present requires altering the course, the modus operandi, the method and thinking with relentless action. The act of realizing such projects, irrespective of how small, lies in resuscitating cities. The revival, through reworking and transferring complex forms, connections, patterns, and trends that make the Medina is an irresistible and compelling act we are obliged to contemplate and sustain. An emerging pattern to consolidate and inspire a contemporary language that is sustainable, attractive, and desirable for the future. This establishes the paradigm that will enable us to bridge over a prevalent, murky political present towards the future of cities for livable communities. In closing, I should like to add that the relationship that is established between the architect and client is consolidated by the master builders and craftsmen, and that this has proved a successful formula, redefining the role of architects and builders. Here, the architect is humbled by the work processes and accomplishment, where a different paradigm and pedagogy is at work. If precedence is established in working with and regenerating architecture and the accompanying ecological systems, then we will have succeeded as catalysts in bringing change that is needed, irrespective of how small.
Hola, my friends from Prince Claus Fund. I am Carla Fernandez. I am a Mexican designer that has a house of fashion. And what we do is that we collaborate with more than 200 artisans all around Mexico, not only in the productive way, but also in the creative way. We have a pedagogy that we have even designed to have a conversation in design terms with communities that don't speak Spanish. So it's a visual pedagogy that we can create new designs based on traditional methods. We also have a manifesto that is called Manifesto of Fashion as Resistance, and the piece that we are showing today is called La Quema. It has to do with the burning of those bad habits that we have, and it's focused on the collaboration, on people having this contact with the community, the compromise with the community, the earth, and the processes of making slow fashion. That fashion is not ephemeral and that tradition is not static. And that's how we show it in this video made by videographer Héctor Del Mal and Ricardo Ramos, and done with the dance company called No Words. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope to hug you very soon.